Welcome back, everybody, to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's course, we continue with Jenkins Quick Start. All right, so now that we have our Jenkins instance configured and set up for our use, which we see here, before we do anything, we've got to take care of a few housekeeping items on the systems itself. So by default, all of the processes that Jenkins will run will by default run with the Jenkins user ID. The problem with the Jenkins user ID as it's initially set up is that it's too restricted for us in order to do most things. So let's take a look at what that means. So let's cat out, for example, etc password, and we'll grep for the Jenkins user. And the Jenkins user looks fine until we get to here, which says that it's been false. And for those of you who are less familiar with Linux, that means that there's no shell that the Jenkins user ID will be presented with when it does anything or attempts to log in. In other words, it's a non-interactive user. The other way that we could say that is we could say bin no login. Bin false just means, hey, execute false and dump out. The home directory being var lib Jenkins is fine because we're typically, at least from our perspective, we're not going to be the Jenkins user at the command line, but we do want the Jenkins user to be a user that can generate a login shell if needed. So the easiest way to fix that is just doing a vim on etc password, and let's do Jenkins. We could do a user mod for this, but since all we're doing here is changing this to bash. We want, and you'll see a number of other services have no login, but what we want us to be able to do is the same thing for our root user or for our user use the default system shell, which is bin bash. So we'll go ahead and write that. And now the Jenkins user is able to log in. So let's go ahead and do an su to Jenkins. Now, where am I? I'm in var lib Jenkins, and I don't have a lot of the environment stuff set up for the Jenkins user, but again, that's fine. Most of what I'm going to do with the Jenkins user, I would pass in whatever information, environmental or otherwise, that's necessary to my builds. I'm going to run all my builds as the Jenkins user, which is a non-privileged user by default, but we're going to fix that. So the first thing that I need to take a look at is I need to generate some SSH keys, because this is how I'm going to, if I need to log into particularly slave nodes or build servers, I need to have a user ID that I can use for that purpose. If you don't know what SSH keys are, again, they're covered in more detail in various courses, and we do cover it in a little more detail in the full Jenkins course. Right now, we're going to execute a command to generate an SSH key. We're going to keep with all of the defaults. And then we're going to do an SSH copy ID to localhost. And we can say Jenkins at localhost if we want. Yes, I'm sure. It's going to ask for the password. And we're going to error out. And that's because we haven't actually set the password for Jenkins yet. So be sure you go back and do password Jenkins and you give the Jenkins user a password. That way when we run our copy ID, after we run our keygen, as you can see, when we run the copy ID, we'll be prompted with a password that we can then enter. And then we should just be able to do, for example, SSH localhost, and we won't be prompted for a login password. And we're going to do the same thing for the remote user that we have as well. One other item we want to do on this local server is we want to do a vi sudo, and right underneath of where I have root, we're going to indicate that the Jenkins user should be all, no password, all. This isn't strictly necessary if you don't want to have the Jenkins user be a no password user, because you can pass it in at the command line if you want. This just makes it easier to run your builds because you don't have to worry about passing in a password or someone knowing what that password is. How you secure your environment certainly is up to you, and best practices would indicate you have the Jenkins user as a privileged user, but it still requires a password. In this case, we're just setting up a minimal installation with one other build slave, so we just want to be able to execute commands without worrying about a password. So we'll add them to vi sudo. And now what we want to do is we have a second server now. This is our Jenkins master node. This is another Linux Academy lab server. And all we want to do over here, we don't need to install Jenkins. All we're going to do is add the Jenkins user, and we're going to give it a password that should match the primary one, but doesn't necessarily have to. And we're also going to do vi sudo so that we can give the Jenkins user sudo rights on this system as well. Again, this is making it so that when we run commands on our build slave or as a node, the Jenkins user has the authentication necessary, and we control that from the master server. When we create the build, we'll indicate whether it should run with sudo privileges or not. So now that we have that, what we're going to do is let's do an SSH copy ID, but in this case, we're going to copy it to the second server. So let's do SSH. Let's become the Jenkins user again, SU, Jenkins, SSH copy ID, Jenkins at tcox2.mylabserver.com. Yes. And put in the password. Now we should just be able to do an SSH tcox2 mylabserver.com, which gives me access to that second server. Okay. Now that I'm logged in or able to log in without any key and run sudo commands without indicating sudo, then all of my settings for that particular server as well as the node are set up. So what we did here is our Jenkins process is a service that runs, and everything that it runs when we create a build will run as the Jenkins user by default. We can change that if we pass in other credentials, which we'll show you when we create our builds. But in this case, we want the Jenkins user to be able to run sudo commands both on the master node as well as on the slave node. So we've created the Jenkins user on the slave node. We've enabled login on the master node, created the keys, exchanged it with both ourselves and the slave node. And I know it sounds strange in order to exchange the key with localhost, but you want to do that because in Jenkins, you're going, even if you do a build on your master node itself, which you may do for any number of reasons, sharing of resources being one of them, you're going to be doing builds based on SSH and other scripts that may need to generate a login shell. And as a result, you're going to need to have a user that has the ability to generate a login shell, which the Jenkins user ID does not by default during install. So we just set it up so that it is a login user. It has sudo rights without a password. So we're going to use that account throughout the remainder of this course, where we continue to use it for doing builds for the Jenkins master node, either locally or on the remote node. So in this case, we've got a Jenkins master node, which is where my server's installed, a slave node, which is what we're going to do builds against, and then later on, we're going to add it as a server that can do builds for us by passing off builds from the master. And master slave nodes are covered in great detail in the overall Jenkins course. We're going to touch upon it and how we define those nodes from within this course, but we're not going to spend a lot of time there. This is a very simple setup for Jenkins where we're going to be executing builds directly from our master to other systems. But for preparing our Jenkins account with key exchange to be sure that we can communicate without a password for sudo as well as without a password for the account and generating a login, that's all there is to it. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.